So very good morning and welcome again to the Gnostic Centre. This morning we have a talk by Richard Hartz on Savitri and the Veda. Just a few lines about Richard. You must have all read about him, but he's been living in the ashram, has been responsible for bringing out the editions of Sri Aurobindo's collected works, has worked extensively on Savitri, on Record of Yoga, and has written several books, Clasp of Civilizations, and is also a scholar of Sanskrit, and has, given his whole life to the study and the writings of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. I think we will all benefit from his scholarly and I would say his own sadhana in the ashram and what he brings to the study of Savitri. As you know, Savitri is one of the most important works of Sri Aurobindo, and it's very difficult to understand what lies behind Savitri. It seems very, beautiful poetry, but when Sri Aurobindo wrote it, what were the influences behind his writing? How did he write it? What were the various components that brought about Savitri? I think Richard would be perhaps the best person today, I would almost say in the world, to bring this out. So with this, I invite Richard to give his talk.
When I was asked to give a talk on Savitri, I wanted to take a topic that hasn't been explored much. And so I've chosen this topic of Savitri and the Veda because there's a very deep connection between Sri Aurobindo's Savitri and the ancient text known as the Veda, particularly what is the Rig Veda. People often speak of the Vedas in the plural. There are the Rig Veda, Yajur Veda, Sama Veda, Atharva Veda, but the Veda of the mantras within the how to refer to the Rig Veda as Veda. So I've been given quite a lot of time to cover this topic, and so I've divided it into basically 5 sections with a prologue at the beginning. The first, these one could say are the main themes of the talk. First, the first deep connection between Savitri and the Veda comes from the fact that Savitri is a record of Sri Aurobindo's spiritual development, his experiences and realizations, his yogic practice. And he found out at a quite early stage in his spiritual practice that his own practice was spontaneously converging with the ancient path which he discovered in the Veda. So we'll look a little bit at that. Then we have to situate the Veda in the age in which it was written and get some sense of what Sri Aurobindo's attitude towards that ancient Vedic age was, because I don't want to give the impression that Sri Aurobindo idealized some past golden age and wanted to go back to the past. Savitri is the epic of the future. Savitri is all about the future. But Sri Aurobindo found in the Veda a knowledge which has been lost, which he believed is the secret of the future, the key to future realizations. So even though he spent so much time studying this very ancient text, it was not out of antiquarianism of any sort, but because he discovered there the knowledge which he felt that is needed for humanity to move forward in its evolution. So then we'll come to the central topic, which is the subtitle of the epic, Savitri, a legend and a symbol. What the legend is, the legend which comes from the Mahabharata, and how Sri Aurobindo reinterpreted that legend as a symbolic myth of the Vedic cycle. How and why, what the justification for that was, and what that tells us about the meaning of Savitri, because the spirit of Sri Aurobindo's Savitri is very different from the spirit of the episode in the Mahabharata, which is the only, or at least the most ancient source for the legend. But Sri Aurobindo found keys in the names of the characters and the events of the legend, which to him pointed to an earlier origin with quite a different significance. So that will be the third major topic. The longest section, and I'll see how much of this I have time for, is specific Vedic symbols and allusions in Savitri. This is the most obvious connection in a certain way that anyone who has read The Secret of the Veda, Sri Aurobindo's book on the Veda, and reads Savitri is likely to notice here and there allusions to the Veda or the use of symbols which are found in the Veda. One could expound on that more or less indefinitely. I've chosen some of the most significant of those. But I want to leave time at the end for a topic which will lead into the other talk I'm going to be giving here on Monday morning on Savitri as mantra, because Sri Aurobindo's conception of the mantra, when he speaks of the mantra in the context of English poetry, he's extending the Vedic concept of the mantra to poetry in general, and specifically to Savitri. But in this talk, I'll situate the idea of the mantra in the original Vedic context, and on Monday I'll develop how Sri Aurobindo tried to write mantric poetry in English, particularly in Savitri. So these are the main topics that I'm going to cover. I'll begin, though, by juxtaposing some lines from Savitri with some verses from the Veda, which a juxtaposition which shows certain things which I'll be coming back to later and dealing with in more detail, but just to give an idea of why one should talk about Savitri and the Veda at all, why one should connect these two topics. The best place to start is just by reading a little bit of Savitri and then reading a little bit of the Veda and seeing that there are obvious connections. So what I'm going to do is to take just a page or so worth of lines from Savitri, but not one continuous passage. These are lines selected from about 4 pages in the 3rd canto of Savitri, which is called the Yoga of the King, the Yoga of the Soul's Release. And this, together with the 5th canto, which is also has the title of the Yoga of the King, namely King Ashwapati, it is clearly a description of Sri Aurobindo's own yoga under the name of Ashwapati, who was Savitri's father. We'll see more about Ashwapati when we come to a legend and a symbol. But for now, this passage will introduce most of the main themes of the talk, because it contains some of the most striking Vedic symbols and allusions near the end of the passage that I'll read. It's also very much a description of what Sri Aurobindo found in the Veda when he noticed a convergence between his own experiences and those described in the Veda. And it also speaks of the process of inspiration by which the mantra arrives. So I'll read line by line, because Sri Aurobindo emphasized the fact that one of the characteristics of the poetry he was writing in Savitri is that each line stands by itself. Each line is a mantra in a certain sense and can be used for the realization for some particular aspect of what one is seeking. So I'll begin with these lines from Savitri, and then I'll proceed directly to some mantras of the Veda, first in Sanskrit, chanted more or less in a traditional way, and then with Sri Aurobindo's English translation. And then I'll put some of those lines and passages side by side, and we'll then see where that leads. Oft inspiration with her lightning feet, a sudden messenger from the all-seeing tops, traversed the soundless corridors of his mind, bringing her rhythmic sense of hidden things. A music spoke, transcending mortal speech, as if from a golden phial of the all-bliss, a joy of light, a joy of sudden sight, a rapture of the thrilled, undying word poured into his heart as into an empty cup, a repetition of God's first delight, creating in a young and virgin time. The intense creatrix in his stillness wrought. Her power, fallen speechless, grew more intimate. She looked upon the seen and the unforeseen. Unguessed domains she made her native field. An eye awake in voiceless heights of trance, a mind plucking at the unimaginable, overleaping with a soul and perilous bound, the high black wall hiding superconscience. She broke in with inspired speech for scythe and plundered the unknowable's vast estate. A gleaner of infinitesimal grains of truth, a sheaf binder of infinite experience, she pierced the guarded mysteries of world force and her magic methods wrapped in 1,000 veils. Or she gathered the lost secrets dropped by time in the dust and crannies of his mounting route, mid old forsaken dreams of hastening mind and buried remnants of forgotten space. A traveler between summit and abyss, she joined the distant ends, the viewless deeps, or streaked along the roads of heaven and hell, pursuing all knowledge like a questing hound. In the deep subconscious glowed her jewel lamp. Lifted, it showed the riches of the cave, where by the miser traffickers of sense, unused, guarded beneath night's dragon paws, in folds of velvet darkness draped they sleep, whose priceless value could have saved the world. A darkness carrying morning in its breast looked for the eternal wide returning gleam, waiting the advent of a larger ray and rescue of the lost herds of the sun. Parayati nam anueti patha ayati nam pratama shashwati nam vyuchanti jivamudirayanti ushamritam kanchana bodhayanti. She follows to the goal of those that are passing on beyond. She is the first in the eternal succession of the dawns that are coming. Usha widens, bringing out that which lives, awakening someone who was dead. Kiyati ayat samaya bhavati yavi ushuryascha nunam viuchan anupurva kripate vavashana pradidhyana joshamanyabhireti. What is her scope when she harmonizes with the dawns that shone out before and those that now must shine? She desires the ancient mornings and fulfills their light, projecting forwards her illumination. She enters into communion with the rest that are to come. Imam dhyam saptashirshnim pitana rita prajatam brihatim avindat turiyam swijjanayad vishwajanyo ayasya uktamindraya shansan ritam shansanta rijudidhyana divasputra so asurasya viraha Vipram padamangiraso dadhana yajñasya dhama pratamam mananta. He found the vast thought with 7 heads that is born of the truth. He created some 4th world and became universal. The sons of heaven, the heroes of the omnipotent, thinking the straight thought, giving voice to the truth, founded the plane of illumination and conceived the first abode of the sacrifice. Ansari vasakibhir vavadabhir ashman mayani nahana vyasyan brihaspatir abhinikanikratadga utaprastauducha vidwan agayat avoduabhyam paraekayaga guhatishtanti randritasya setau Prahaspatistamasi jyotirichan udusraakar vihitisraava. The master of wisdom cast down the stone defenses and called to the herds of light. The herds that stand in the secrecy on the bridge over the falsehood between 2 worlds below and 1 above. Desiring light in the darkness, he brought upward the ray herds and uncovered from the veil the 3 worlds. Vibhidya puram shayate mapachim nistrini sakam udadhera krintat prihaspatir ushasam suryam gam arkam viveda stanayan nivadyao. He shattered the city that lies in ambush and cut the 3 out of the ocean and discovered the dawn and the sun and the light and the word of light. Now, let me go back to the last 4 lines, the last sentence that I read from Savitri, which began, a darkness carrying morning in its breast looked for the eternal wide returning gleam, waiting the advent of a larger ray. And the first verse from the Veda that I read in translation, she follows to the goal of those that are passing on beyond. She is the first in the eternal succession of the dawns that are coming. Now, this is an example of a reasonably clear allusion to the Veda, since we know that this was an important verse in the Rig Veda, in the first mandala for Sri Aurobindo, because these are the opening words of the Life Divine. When he presented his own philosophy in the Life Divine, he began with a quotation from a hymn to dawn. And so the Life Divine begins with these words referring to the eternal succession of the dawns that are coming. Now, what struck me thinking about the connection between these two is that Sri Aurobindo stands in somewhat the same relation to the Vedic dawn as the rishis of the Veda stood to their distant forefathers whose discoveries they celebrate. The rishis followed the path that had been opened in much more ancient times, according to their account, semi-mythical, but also partly legendary, presumably based on a living tradition of an ancient knowledge already in the Vedic times. Sri Aurobindo is now recovering likewise an ancient knowledge from the Veda, but Sri Aurobindo also does not consider himself to be the end of the evolution. The dawn, even the dawn of the supramental age, is a larger ray than any that has come before, but it's not the end of this eternal succession. Then there's the line, the most obvious reference to the Veda here, and rescue of the lost herds of the sun. This line in Savitri would make relatively little sense to anyone who's not familiar with Sri Aurobindo's writings on the Veda, where about half of the secret of the Veda is taken up with a detailed examination of the myth of the Angiras rishis and their discovery of their rescue precisely of the lost herds of the sun, the cows of the sun god Surya, who were imprisoned in a cave in a mountain. Every detail of this is symbolic by the Panis. And the Panis also, we'll see in a moment, are the miser traffickers of sense who are mentioned in this same passage. This, about the last 10 or 15, at least 12 or so lines of what I read from Savitri are all direct allusions to the Veda. Whereas the passage as a whole, although it describes what can be called a Vedic sadhana, the imagery beginning oft inspiration with her lightning feet. The inspiration, as we'll see in a moment, inspiration, intuition, Sarama, who finds the lost herds, is the goddess of intuition, the goddess of revelation, and there's a fourth in Dakshina representing intuitive discrimination. Sri Aurobindo had begun to experience the opening of all these faculties in himself before he began to read the Veda. But when he turned to the Veda, he recognized his own experiences. And so it was this that first attracted him to make a deeper study of the Veda. So here we have in the Veda, I quoted one of many passages referring to these lost herds of the sun, because the victory of the fathers, as Sri Aurobindo calls it in one chapter of The Secret of the Veda, is celebrated throughout the Veda. References to it are scattered through all the 10 mandalas. Here, the rishis also were aided by various gods. Most often Indra, here it's Brihaspati, the master of wisdom. And he cast down the stone defenses. These are, this is what is described as breaking open the hill, entering the cave in the hill or the mountain, symbolizing the physical being. And so this discovery of the light imprisoned in matter is one which is very central to Savitri, and we're going to be seeing a lot more about that. Desiring light in the darkness. This is not just desiring the sun to rise in the morning. The Vedic rishis were not primitive, superstitious barbarians who believed that they had to perform a sacrifice before the sun would rise. But they found a deep symbolic meaning in that which correspond to their own, an experience of theirs which was also very central to Sri Aurobindo's yoga. So Brihaspati discovered the dawn and the sun and the light and the word of light. This was in the ancient times when the path was opened. And so this is Sri Aurobindo's the first paragraph of the Life Divine, following the quotations from the Veda, a couple of verses of which I've just read. And here he brings out the significance of this ancient dawn to him and to humanity. The earliest preoccupation of man in his awakened thoughts, and as it seems, his inevitable and ultimate preoccupation, is also the highest which his thought can envisage. The ancient dawns of human knowledge have left us their witness to this constant aspiration. Today we see a humanity satiated but not satisfied, but by victorious analysis of the externalities of nature, preparing to return to its primeval longings. This was written 100 years ago or so, and we're still seeing humanity preparing to return to these ancient longings, the pursuit of this highest knowledge that mankind can envisage. The earliest formula of wisdom promises to be its last: God, light, freedom, immortality. So this is the subject of the Veda, although expressed in a symbolic language, and this is the subject of the Life Divine and all of Sri Aurobindo's writings, and it is above all the subject of Savitri. So now we come to more specific parallels between the yoga described in Savitri, particularly the two cantos called the Yoga of the King, where Ashwapati clearly corresponds to Sri Aurobindo in terms of his experiences being Sri Aurobindo's experiences. Of course, there's another long book of yoga later. The book of yoga is Savitri's Yoga, and that also is based on Sri Aurobindo's experience as well as the mother's. So, first of all, the word yoga. We don't usually think of the Veda when we think of yoga, at least most people. I don't think, if they hear a phrase like Vedic Yoga, they would think that one is kind of reading later ideas into the Veda, but this is what the Veda itself says. And this verse begins with the verb from which the word yoga is formed, yunjate, which is translated by yoke. It means exactly the same as the English word yoke. And it describes a yoga. It uses this word yoking in precisely the sense that is meant when yoga is called, what we call yoga is referred to by the word yoga. Yunjate mana uta yunjate dhiyo vipra viprasya brihato vipaschita vihotra dadhe vayuna videka in mahi devasya savitu parishtuti. This is the first verse of one of the selected hymns which Sri Aurobindo has translated along with the Secret of the Veda. Many illumined yoke their mind and they yoke their thoughts to him who is illumination and largeness and clear perceiving. Knowing all phenomena, he orders soul the energies of the sacrifice. Vast is the affirmation in all things of Savitri, the divine creator. This is not Savitri, with a long A and a long final I, but Savitri. And Savitri is the daughter of the sun, Savitri. But that connection is highly significant, and in a way, Savitri, the creator, the sun as the divine creator, is in certain respects perhaps the most important Vedic deity, although Agni and Indra are invoked more frequently and perform functions that were perhaps more important in the everyday sadhana of the rishis. But in the end, it's Savitri who represents the supermind, and what the Vedic Yoga aspired to is represented by the Savitri, Surya Savitri as the deity of the supramental plane. So Sri Aurobindo comments on this verse saying, the solar energy is the physical form of Surya, Lord of light and truth. It is through the truth that we arrive at immortality, final aim of the Vedic discipline. It is therefore under the images of the sun and its rays, of dawn and day and night, and the life of man between the two poles of light and darkness, that the Aryan seers represent the progressive illumination of the human soul. Men, as soon as they begin to receive something of this solar illumination, strive to yoke their whole mentality and its thought contents to the conscious existence of the divine Surya within them. That is to say, they apply, as it were, all their obscure mental state and all their erring thoughts to this light manifested in them, so that it may turn the obscurity of the mind into clearness and convert the errors of thought into those truths which they distortedly represent. This yoking, yunjate, becomes their yoga. So this is the Vedic Yoga. And in Savitri, the word yoke is also used in exactly the same sense of yoga, and specifically karma yoga, because the yoga of the Veda was a karma yoga. It was symbolized by the ritual of the sacrifice, but the ritual of the sacrifice was a symbol. And when the Gita takes up the symbol of sacrifice and makes it the basis of its karma yoga, it's merely reviving and restating this ancient karma yoga of the Veda. Now in Savitri, in Book 11, after Savitri rejects all the high spiritual realizations that are offered to her, by which she would not have to return to this difficult life on earth. She rejects all of that, and then the voice of the Supreme Godhead speaks to her. But since thou hast refused my nameless calm, and turned from my termless peace, in which is expunged the visage of space, and the shape of time is lost, and from happy extinction of thy separate self, in my uncompanioned lone eternity, I lay my hands upon thy soul of flame. I lay my hands upon thy heart of love. I yoke thee to my power of work in time. So this is the aspect of the tradition of yoga that Sri Aurobindo, like the Gita, again emphasized after a long period when some of the temptations that Savitri refused to succumb to, the nameless calm, etc., which she refused, those became the main object of Indian spirituality during a long period when the ideals of asceticism prevailed over the more dynamic spirit of the ancient yoga. So now we come to what Sri Aurobindo himself said in a remarkable statement in a chapter of The Secret of the Veda, which was published in one of the early issues of the Arya. And what's remarkable about it is that it's practically the only place in all of Sri Aurobindo's writings that were intended for publication, as opposed to letters that were written to private individuals and later published. It's practically the only place where he uses the first person. And he gives us information about his own sadhana, which we never would have known. We might have inferred, perhaps, without, if he hadn't written this paragraph in The Secret of the Veda, and contrary to his normal practice, instead of making some general impersonal statement about possible realizations, speaks of himself and begins with the word my. My first contact with Vedic thought came indirectly while pursuing certain lines of self-development in the way of Indian yoga, which, without my knowing it, were spontaneously converging towards the ancient and now unfrequented paths followed by our forefathers. So I think Sri Aurobindo saw the importance of making it clear, because his Secret of the Veda is such a radical reinterpretation of the Veda. It goes so much against so many centuries of tradition, traditional Vedic interpretation, which see little more than ritual in the Veda and regard it as karma kanda, not karma yoga, but simply the karma kanda, as opposed to the jnana kanda, where all the knowledge, the notion that Veda means knowledge, the knowledge was relegated to the Vedanta, the Upanishads, and the Veda was not in practice, whatever the theory may have been, was not treated as a source of the highest spiritual knowledge. Therefore, Sri Aurobindo, of course, knew what everybody else knew about the ancient spiritual tradition when he, during this period, this is sometime after he came out of Alipur jail, probably, it seems it might have been a little bit before he arrived in Pondicherry, because the next paragraph begins with a reference to his coming to Pondicherry, coming to South India. In any case, whenever it was not through a study of the Veda that he came to see this convergence with his own path. It came about spontaneously, and he goes on to explain what he means by that. At this time, there began to arise in my mind an arrangement of symbolic names attached to certain psychological experiences which had begun to regularize themselves. And among them, there came the figures of three female energies, Ila, Saraswati, Sarama, representing severally 3 out of the 4 faculties of the intuitive reason: revelation, Ila, inspiration, Saraswati, and intuition, Sarama. Now, there's a fourth. He mentions 3 out of the 4. The fourth is Dakshina. In another passage later on, he explains the fourth. Dakshina, like the more famous Ila, Saraswati, and Sarama, is one of 4 goddesses representing the 4 faculties of the Ritam, or truth consciousness. Ila representing truth vision or revelation, Saraswati, truth audition, inspiration, the divine word, Sarama, intuition, and Dakshina, the separative intuitional discrimination. So in the canto which I was reading from, there is a lot about these faculties, and the immediately preceding lines are also worth quoting, because this mighty whisper has to do with the truth, the faculty of truth audition, the hearing, truth hearing. So it begins with Saraswati. There are flashes of an occult revealing light a couple lines later which refer to the faculty of vision, and then Dakshina, the intuitive discrimination, is mentioned, and it's a couple pages later that the fourth, Sarama, comes in as the hound of heaven. So I'll read a few of these lines. A dense veil was rent, a mighty whisper heard, repeated in the privacy of his soul, a wisdom cry from rapt transcendences sang on the mountains of an unseen world. The voices that an inner listening hears conveyed to him their prophet utterances, and flame-wrapped outbursts of the immortal word and flashes of an occult revealing light approached him from the unreachable secrecy. An ictus of revealing luster fell as if a pointing accent upon truth, and like a sky flare showing all the ground, a swift intuitive discernment shone. So that's dakshina. Then we'll come to Sarama. I already read the lines referring to Sarama pursuing all knowledge like a questing hound. The names, the Vedic names, of course, are not given in Savitri, but the reference to Sarama is quite unmistakable. And in The Secret of the Veda, Sri Aurobindo explains, Sarama, who leads in the search for the radiant herds and discovers both the path and the secret hold in the mountain, must be a forerunner of the dawn of truth in the human mind, because she leads the gods and the rishis to the cave in the mountain where not only the herds of the sun, but the sun itself is imprisoned. And so Sarama does that before the light of the sun has begun to dawn. So she's the forerunner, and intuition is the first faculty that comes to us from this higher consciousness, as he says. And if we ask ourselves what power among the truth-finding faculties it is that thus discovers out of the darkness of the unknown in our being the truth that is hidden in it, we at once think of the intuition. Even in our ordinary common use of intuition, we tend to use it to mean something of this nature. For Sarama is not Saraswati. She is not the inspiration, even though the names are similar. Saraswati gives the full flood of the knowledge. Sarama is the traveler and seeker on its path, who does not herself possess, but rather finds that which is lost. One hymn in the 10th mandala is devoted entirely to the colloquy of Sarama and the Panis. We may note, however, that neither in this hymn nor in the others we have noticed is there the least indication of the figure of the divine hound, which was attributed to Sarama in a possibly later development of the Vedic imagery. The image of the hound of heaven is, however, exceedingly apt and striking, and was bound to develop out of the legend. It was apt and striking enough that Sri Aurobindo found it worth incorporating in Savitri in these lines. And the obvious reference to Sarama is in the last line that I read, pursuing all knowledge like a questing hound. But if one looks at the whole sentence, one sees how closely Sri Aurobindo is following the Veda here. In the one of the later chapters of The Secret of the Veda, he refers to different sources for what Sarama does, and finds there that Sarama descends from the supreme realm, Parakat. She arrives at the home of the Dasyus, Dasyor Oko Nasaranam, the hostile beings referred to as Dasyus, which they themselves describe as the Reku Padam Alakam, the world of falsehood beyond the bound of things. So Sarama, as a traveler between summit and abyss, descends from the supreme realm into the world of falsehood at the other end of things, the abyss, in other words. She's a traveler between summit and abyss. She streaks along the roads of heaven and hell. The distant ends, the viewless deeps, are at both ends of things, those beyond our normal consciousness. Then later in the same passage in Savitri, there are these lines: in the deep subconscious glowed her jewel lamp. This is not Sarama anymore, but it's the various goddesses are seem to be combined. The inspiring goddess, she has been called a few lines earlier, the goddess of inspiration, revelation, intuition, seem to be rolled into one. And this is the goddess who discovers, actually it's the function of Sarama to find the riches of the cave. So one could say this is the intuition. In the deep subconscious glowed her jewel lamp. Lifted, it showed the riches of the cave, where by the miser traffickers of sense unused, guarded beneath night's dragon paws, in folds of velvet darkness draped, they sleep, etc. So here actually Sri Aurobindo makes fairly free use of the Vedic symbolism, and it's worth noting that the Veda itself makes fairly free use of its own mythology and imagery, so that you have Vritra, who is usually associated with a different legend of the release of the waters from the same hill of the physical being, is brought in here with reference to, in close connection with the Panis, who are the ones who stole the herds of the sun, the cows of the sun, the illuminations of the higher knowledge. And so, but the Veda itself does this sometimes, because as Sri Aurobindo says, Vritra, the serpent or the dragon, he uses the word dragon paws instead of the coils of the serpent there, but the meaning is the same, is the grand adversary. In other words, he encompasses all of the hostile forces in himself. He's the coverer, vri, to cover. For he obstructs with his coils of darkness all possibility of divine existence and divine action. The waters are the waters of being, and he obstructs their flow. But he also withholds the light at the same time, because those things go together. Then there are Vela and the Panis. Vela is the chief of these Panis, who in the secret of the Veda, Sri Aurobindo defines as miser traffickers in the sense life. And he's almost quoted himself, plagiarized himself, you might say, in Savitri by using the same phrase, whereby the miser traffickers of sense unused. They're the stealers and concealers of the higher light and its illuminations. So here there's a very clear Vedic reference again, and rather detailed, about the riches of the cave, these riches that this goddess of intuition finds in the subconscious. The subconscious is symbolized by the cave. Sri Aurobindo writes, in general, the lower is for us the first condition of the higher. The darkness is the dense body of the light. The unconscious guards in itself all the concealed superconscious. The powers of the division and falsehood hold from us, but also for us, and to be conquered from them, the riches and substance of the unity and the truth in their cave of subconscious. So although these are forces, powers of division and falsehood, they are not entirely to be annihilated. They're to be conquered, and their riches to be won from them. This was expressed in the highly figured, enigmatic language of the early mystics, the sense and justification of man's actual existence and his conscious or unconscious Godward effort. The Vedic idea was that the subconscious darkness and the ordinary life of ignorance held concealed in it all that belongs to the divine life, and that these secret riches must be recovered first by destroying the impenitent powers of ignorance, and then by possessing the lower life subject to the higher. This is the work set for humanity, and the ancestors have done it for the race, that the way may be known and the goal reached by the same means and through the same companionship with the gods of light. And then he makes a very interesting observation, not confining himself to the Veda, at the beginning of all human traditions there is this ancient memory. It is Indra and the serpent Vritra. It is Apollo and the python. It is Thor and the giants, Sigurd and Fafnir. It is the mutually opposing gods of the Celtic mythology. Only in the Veda do we find the key to this imagery which conceals the hope or the wisdom of a prehistoric humanity. So these are some of the things that Sri Aurobindo found in the Veda. Some of them he found almost immediately. In fact, when he turned to the Veda, he had already experienced some of the things and recognized some of the experiences described there. But as he went deeper into the Veda, he found much more, and perhaps it's hard to say how much he owed to the Veda in terms of whether his own lines of self-development continued to proceed independently, and without, even if he hadn't discovered the Veda, he might have arrived at the same realizations. But in any case, for the purpose of his writings, he found it very useful to be able to refer to something in the past that supported what he was presenting, and particularly in the Life Divine. This is in one of the first chapters where Sri Aurobindo talks about the supermind, introduces his conception of the supermind, and he asks whether there's anything in the past that we can find which would help us to guide us in this unexplored domain. And he says, it is the cryptic verses of the Veda that contain, though concealed, the gospel of the divine and immortal supermind, and through the veil some illumining flashes come to us. Vast all-comprehensiveness, luminous truth and harmony of being in that vastness, and not a vague chaos or self-lost obscurity. Truth of law and act and knowledge, expressive of that harmonious truth of being. These seem to be the essential terms of the Vedic description. He's turned around the order in which he often describes them: the truth, the right, the vast. Truth of being, the second one that he described, luminous truth and harmony of being in that vastness, is Satyam, the truth. Sri Aurobindo reserves, when he has to distinguish Satyam from Ritam, the two Vedic words for truth, he uses the word right for Ritam, which is truth of law and act and knowledge, truth of manifestation, expression, organization, whereas Satya is the static truth of essential being. But both are only possible in a vast all-comprehensiveness. There has to be a vastness of consciousness which contains them. So that's the Brihat. Satyam, Ritam, Brihat is the order in which Sri Aurobindo usually lists them, although in fact in the Veda, mostly in the Rig Veda particularly, you don't come across those three in that order, but you come across many combinations and permutations of Satyam, Ritam and Brihat, particularly Satyam, Brihat, Ritam, Brihat, 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 Ritam, and etc., all different combinations. The three, if one studies the Veda as a whole, emerge as its basic description of this supramental consciousness. And we have in Savitri a specific allusion to the Veda, this phrase, Satyam, Ritam, Brihat, the truth, the right, the vast, which actually occurs in the Atharva Veda, one of the few places where Sri Aurobindo draws on one of the other Vedas besides the Rig Veda. A few shall glimpse the miraculous origin. Ascending out of the limiting breadths of mind, they shall discover the world's huge design and step into the truth, the right, the vast. So Sri Aurobindo in Savitri here has made almost a whole line of this, out of this phrase, the truth, the right, the vast, which he had first translated from Sanskrit, from the Vedic words many years earlier in The Life Divine, which he had begun to write a couple of years before even the first draft of Savitri. So another, in The Life Divine, in the same chapter, another phrase that Sri Aurobindo refers explicitly to the Veda for is Rita Chit, truth conscious. And he uses truth consciousness as one of his regular terms for the supermind, the supramental consciousness. Because the supermind, the term supermind rather, tells us what the supermind isn't. It's above mind, so it's something other than the mind, but it doesn't say anything positive about it. The truth consciousness, especially if one understands the word truth in the context of the truth, the right, the vast, in this vast comprehensiveness, truth consciousness then becomes an adequate description of the nature of the supramental consciousness. So the gods, who in their highest secret entity are powers of this supermind, born of it, seated in it as in their proper home, are in their knowledge truth consciousness. Here in the life, this is from the Life Divine, but Sri Aurobindo is referring to the Vedic gods. And we have truth conscious in Savitri itself. Our greater self of knowledge waits for us, a supreme light in the truth conscious vast. Supreme light, incidentally, is also a Vedic expression. Jyotir Uttamam. If we have time later on, we'll come to the verse that uses this phrase, supreme light in the Veda. And Rita Chit, this whole line, in other words, is composed entirely from Vedic words, words which have direct counterparts in Vedic Sanskrit. It sees from summits beyond thinking mind. It moves in a splendid air transcending life. It shall descend and make earth's life divine. So this, of course, is what Sri Aurobindo's philosophy and his yoga are all about. He called his major work on philosophy the Life Divine, and Savitri, in a sense, is the Life Divine in poetry, combined with a lot of other things. But in any case, the basic message of the Life Divine also comes in very prominently in Savitri, and this phrase, Life Divine, occurs several times there. So now I'll try not to spend too much time on this topic, which is not directly about Savitri, but since the Veda has been so badly misunderstood for such a long time, and even now, except among Sri Aurobindo's followers, his writings on the Veda don't seem to have had as much influence as one might have expected. I think it's good to say a little bit about the Veda itself in its own context, in the contexts of the time of the rishis. And so I'll summarize in Sri Aurobindo's own words, I'll take a few key statements from The Secret of the Veda, where because he was breaking with so many centuries of ancient tradition, more recent tradition, you could say, the medieval tradition, the commentary of Sayana, which has been considered definitive for several centuries, was probably written around the 14th century in South India, in Vijayanagar. And so Sri Aurobindo addresses himself in considerable detail to Sayana's interpretation, but for the most part, if he doesn't entirely reject it, he treats it as only the most superficial layer of meaning in these symbolic texts. And so he was going against that, and he was also going against all the European scholarship that had been done, especially by British and German scholars this time, since Sanskrit was first discovered by the British in in the late 1700s and attracted attention. And so, especially in the 19th century, a lot of work had been done on comparative mythology and comparative linguistics based on the Veda, an attempt to reconstruct ancient history based on supposed clues in the Veda. Sri Aurobindo presents a very different interpretation, but he presents it as a hypothesis. Here in the first chapter, he calls it a hypothesis. In the last chapter, he comes back to the question of whether he's substantiated his hypothesis. And after publishing 2 years of monthly installments in the Arya, which form the whole of what Sri Aurobindo completed of The Secret of the Veda, he concludes that we've established a prima facie case for taking this hypothesis seriously. He never claimed that he had proved his theory, but in any case, because he was not writing for his own followers, because since he didn't have any when he wrote the Arya, in 1914 he was almost a political refugee in Pondicherry, known mostly for his role in the freedom struggle and as the Uttara Yogi, the yogi who had come from the north, but he had no reputation on which he could rely for people to take his word for it. So he was writing as a scholar. This is his most scholarly work. And so he presents a hypothesis, and then he presents evidence for the hypothesis. And he considers alternative explanations, which have abounded in previous times up to the present. And so his hypothesis, the hypothesis I propose, is that the Rig Veda is itself the one considerable document that remains to us from the early period of human thought, of which the historic Eleusinian and Orphic mysteries were the failing remnants. And we know practically nothing about the content of these Eleusinian and Orphic mysteries of the ancient Mediterranean world because of the secrecy that surrounded them. In the Veda, a particular solution was found to that problem of maintaining the secrecy of a sacred knowledge, which was to use a system of symbols in which the whole text was written with double meanings, an exoteric and an esoteric meaning. And the esoteric meaning was revealed only to the initiates, as Sri Aurobindo explains. When the spiritual and psychological knowledge of the race was concealed for reasons now difficult to determine in a veil of concrete and material figures and symbols which protected the sense from the profane and revealed it to the initiated. From the historical point of view, the Rig Veda may be regarded as a record of a great advance made by humanity by special means at a certain period of its collective progress. In its esoteric as well as its exoteric significance, it is the book of works, of the inner and the outer sacrifice. It is the spirit's hymn of battle and victory as it discovers and climbs to planes of thought and experience inaccessible to the natural or animal man. Man's praise of the divine light, power, and grace at work in the mortal. Certain it is that the old tradition of a progressive obscuration and loss of the Veda as the law of the human cycle has been fully justified by the event. It could hardly have been otherwise, for the system of the Vedic mystics was founded upon experiences difficult to ordinary mankind, and proceeded by the aid of faculties which in most of us are rudimentary and imperfectly developed, and when active at all are mixed and irregular in their operation. So this is basically Sri Aurobindo's theory, the broad outline, not of the details of his theory, but his general view of what we're looking at when we try to interpret the Veda, that it's the text of an esoteric as well as an exoteric religion, of which only the exoteric sense has been well preserved, with only scattered clues to the esoteric sense. And that was what Sri Aurobindo said about systematically trying to recover. Now, he has referred to the law of a progressive obscuration and loss of the sense of the Veda as a law of the human cycle. He uses here the phrase human cycle, which most readers of Sri Aurobindo's works will associate it with a book that he began to write actually immediately after he discontinued The Secret of the Veda. It's almost a sequel to The Secret of the Veda in the sense that it starts from the symbolic age. Sri Aurobindo relies on his having more or less established his interpretation of the Veda. It also sheds a lot of light on the Veda, and the human cycle comes back to the Veda in the very last pages, where it quotes from the Veda in the last couple of paragraphs. And so actually one cannot really understand Sri Aurobindo's philosophy of history, which he presents in the human cycle, without having some understanding of his theory of the Veda, of what he has said here, that there was an esoteric teaching which was accessible only to a few. And the mass of the Vedic society was on a much lower level of human development. Now, I'm going to, I've drawn a kind of diagram in order to try to show, grossly oversimplified of course, but to try to just give an idea of how Sri Aurobindo reconciles this paradox of a high point of human spiritual development having been reached at a very early stage of collective development, and particularly of the development of the mind. And it has to do with the something that he explains in the chapter of the human cycle called the infrarational age of the cycle, where rather surprisingly he places the Vedic age. After having, in the first part of the book, begun with the notion that much of human history since ancient times has been a kind of decline, a loss of an ancient knowledge, the sense, particularly in the case of India, the loss of the inner meaning of many of the symbols behind many of the main institutions of Indian life. And so it's been, well, Sri Aurobindo refers to it in his writings on Indian culture as an enriching descent, a kind of descent from the spiritual heights that had been reached by the Vedic rishis. But at the same time, there was also much that was developed during this period which was needed for the mass of the society to participate in the realizations of the few, which was not possible in the Vedic age. Notice that now the Veda corresponds to the upper left and the lower left in this chart. The Vedic symbolism is what we're going to be looking at, what Sri Aurobindo incorporates in Savitri, and the Vedic Yoga is expressed in terms of that symbolism. But in the exoteric sense of the Veda, the ritualism was done more or less on what Sri Aurobindo refers to as an infrarational, in the context of an infrarational society. And exactly what he means by these terms, one has to read the human cycle to see. But it's often, I think, not fully understood that Sri Aurobindo combines two views of history that are often assumed to be incompatible. A cyclical view which has been common in most of the world since ancient times. So we have the terms Golden Age, Silver, Bronze, Iron Age in the ancient Greco-Roman world. And then in India, the yugas, Satya, Treta, Dwapara, Kali Yuga, which, although of course the cycle is repeated, so again you have a Satya Yuga, the general impression that it gives is things tend to get worse. That from Satya Yuga to the later ages is a decline. He combines that, and yet that doesn't at first sight seem to agree very well with Sri Aurobindo's philosophy of evolution, which is all about the emergence of consciousness out of the inconscient, moving eventually towards the full re-emergence of all that was involved in the inconscient, supermind and Satchidananda. And so here, what Sri Aurobindo calls the human cycle, in a few places he refers to as a spiral, and that's actually a better image, because cycle gives the impression of something that doesn't go anywhere. It goes around in circles. And so even if you come back to a new symbolic age, there will be again another decline and you'll be back to another Kali Yuga. That's not the way Sri Aurobindo viewed things. And this other scheme, which he introduces about 2/3 of the way through the human cycle, is really more important for his overall philosophy and his view of history and human life. So at the same time, humanity is developing collectively and losing something of what it had already gained. And Sri Aurobindo explains in this chapter on the infrarational age of the cycle, the infrarational stage of society may arrive at a very lofty order of civilization, not only in India but elsewhere in the ancient world. He, side by side, he talks about the parallel, the case of ancient Greece, where it was not spirituality but rationality that first emerged in the midst of an infrarational stage of general development. But in India, we have this case. If spirituality predominates, there will be great mystics capable of delving into the profound and still occult psychological possibilities of our nature, who will divine and realize the truth of the self and spirit in man. And even though they keep these things secret and imparted only to a small number of initiates, may yet succeed in deepening with them the crude forms of the popular life. In prehistoric India, we see it take a peculiar and unique turn which determined the whole future trend of the society and made Indian civilization a thing apart and of its own kind in the history of the human race. But these things are only a first beginning of light in the midst of a humanity which is still infrarational as well as infraspiritual. This is what prevents Sri Aurobindo from idealizing the Vedic age as a whole, as a golden age, which we would want to go back to. We don't want to go back to the Vedic age. We want to go forward and continue the ascent to the dawning of even a greater ray, a greater dawn. And so Sri Aurobindo was interested in recovering what has been lost, and that recovery was important to him, because otherwise the linear view of history, which is associated mostly with the modern Western idea of progress, generally means progress from the irrational to the rational, the infrarational being represented by the irrational, because no suprarational is recognized generally by the Western mind. And therefore progress stops when you reach the rational age. So Sri Aurobindo's originality, although he wasn't the only one who did something of this nature, was to extend the linear view of history, that history is an arrow of progress, that it doesn't go back down, it keeps going up, it goes up and up. But it doesn't stop with the rational mind, it keeps going. But the knowledge needed to actually do that was already there. It was developed in ancient times only in the manner that he describes here, as a beginning of light in the midst of an infrarational as well as infraspiritual humanity. So this is how he explains this, how this was even possible in those primitive times, you might say. The spiritual development arising uncurbed by reason in an infrarational society has often a tendency to outrun at first the rational and intellectual movement. For the greatest illuminating force of the infrarational man as he develops is an inferior intuition, an instinctively intuitional sight arising out of the force of life in him. Somewhat similar to what animals have in the form of instinct. Of course, with them it's much more highly developed because it's not at all curbed by the development of reason. So from that inferior intuition, the transition from this to an intensity of inner life and the growth of a deeper spiritual intuition which outleaps the intellect and seems to dispense with it is an easy passage in the individual man. But for humanity at large, this movement cannot last. The mind and intellect must develop to their fullness so that the spirituality of the race may rise securely upward upon a broad basis of the developed lower nature in man, the intelligent mental being. This is an extremely crucial point because it shows how important this process, the work done by the age of individualism and reason in this human cycle, which has largely, because it began, that stage began in the West and has been largely imposed on the rest of the world. From the West, there's a tendency to want to reject that, and yet that would be a wrong movement, because if it means any kind of irrationalism, an excuse for some kind of, for example, false subjectivism, the way to develop out of the rational age towards a future super-rational age is through a deeper self-discovery, which takes place in what Sri Aurobindo calls a subjective age. But there's a false subjectivism which does away with what has been gained by the use of the reason, rather than developing it further and going higher. So this broad basis of the developed lower nature in man, the intelligent mental being, is extremely important in Sri Aurobindo's view of human history. Now there's another way of looking at this, what I tried to represent by that chart, how there was both a decline and at the same time progress during the early periods from in India, the Vedic age onwards, is described in the Life Divine using the phrase as a principle of concentration and a principle of diffusion. And Sri Aurobindo says there, here in these two forms of the spiritual evolution, the esoteric and the exoteric, the way of the mystic and the way of the religious man, we see a double principle of evolutionary nature. The principle of intensive and concentrated evolution in a small space, and the principle of expansion and extension so that the new creation may be generalized in as large a field as possible. The first is the concentrated, dynamic, and effective movement. The second tends towards diffusion and status. As a result of this new development, the spiritual aspiration, at first carefully treasured by a few, became more generalized in mankind, but it lost in purity, height, and intensity. So this is roughly Sri Aurobindo's explanation of both how and why this process occurred, how there was a very high spiritual realization which was achieved in very ancient times, but it could not be generalized in humanity at that point. Yet Sri Aurobindo believed that now the two arrows will converge, that the downward arrow will change directions, join with the upward arrow, which has been raising the general level of humanity with all sorts of setbacks, of course, but on the whole, out of the infrarational to a rational, a more and more rational stage, and that has to continue. One of the ways of developing the intuitive mind, as Sri Aurobindo describes it in the Synthesis of Yoga, is to develop and perfect the mind rather than silencing it. One can do both. Sri Aurobindo himself did both. But that by developing the mind to its limits, one can transcend it. One can go beyond it by reaching the highest levels of intellectual development, as is seen very often throughout human history in the phenomena of genius, where the great geniuses generally seem to have some kind of access to some super-rational source of knowledge. So this almost concludes this portion of my talk. I just want to end with a statement that Sri Aurobindo made about the secret of the Veda, which he was realistic about in terms of the prospects of his book having much impact on, and in fact he was quite right. I don't think that the secret of the Veda has had very much impact, that the impact that it deserved to have, because in the light of the secret of the Veda one should take a whole different view of human history, and that has not occurred in the mainstream, certainly. Sri Aurobindo was aware of the difficulties, although they may not be as insuperable as they were in ancient times, that there's still the difficulty of bringing this kind of knowledge to a very large public. And he writes at the end of an introduction to some of his translations, which he did after completing the secret of the Veda, to enter into the very heart of the mystic doctrine, we must ourselves have trod the ancient paths and renewed the lost discipline, the forgotten experience. And which of us can hope to do that with any depth or living power? Who in this age of iron shall have the strength to recover the light of the forefathers, or soar above the two enclosing firmaments of mind and body into their luminous empyrean of the infinite truth? Small is the chance that in an age which blinds our eyes with the transient glories of the outward life and deafens our ears with the victorious trumpets of a material and mechanical knowledge, many shall cast more than the eye of an intellectual and imaginative curiosity on the passwords of their ancient discipline, or seek to penetrate into the heart of their radiant mysteries. The secret of the Veda, even when it has been unveiled, remains still a secret. That's very true, and I think, unfortunately, it's also true to a great extent of Savitri, that whatever one says about Savitri at present is still not going to make it accessible to large masses of humanity. Nevertheless, I take this, when he says small is the chance, I take that more as a challenge than as a pessimistic prediction. I think Sri Aurobindo believed that humanity is capable of recovering this ancient knowledge. Otherwise, he wouldn't have bothered to write the secret of the Veda. So we'll take a break now for 15 minutes, and we'll go on and apply this to the main outlines of the legend, which Sri Aurobindo used as the basis for the symbolism of Savitri, and then we'll go into more specific Vedic symbols and allusions. The subtitle of Sri Aurobindo's epic is A Legend and a Symbol, and it's very fortunate that Sri Aurobindo himself wrote a brief explanation of what he means when he calls it a symbol. And this is a short note that was found in one of his notebooks, written fairly late in the process of the writing of Savitri in the late 1940s. And there, Sri Aurobindo I'll read the main points of this short note, and then I'll come back to the main ideas and comment on them. The tale of Satyavan and Savitri is recited in the Mahabharata as a story of conjugal love conquering death. But this legend is, as shown by many features of the human tale, one of the many symbolic myths of the Vedic cycle. Satyavan is the soul carrying the divine truth of being within itself, but descended into the grip of death and ignorance. Savitri is the divine word, daughter of the sun, goddess of the supreme truth, who comes down and is born to save. Ashwapati, the lord of the horse, her human father, is the lord of tapasya, the concentrated energy of spiritual endeavor that helps us to rise from the mortal to the immortal planes. Dyumatsena, lord of the shining hosts, father of Satyavan, is the divine mind, here fallen blind, losing its celestial kingdom of vision, and through that loss, its kingdom of glory. Still, this is no mere allegory. The characters are not personified qualities, but incarnations or emanations of living and conscious forces with whom we can enter into concrete touch, and they take human bodies in order to help man and show him the way from his mortal state to a divine consciousness and immortal life. So let's begin with the last sentence about the distinction between an allegory and a symbol. Sri Aurobindo says that this is a symbol and that it is not an allegory. In a letter, one of his letters on poetry, he says, allegory comes in when a quality or other abstract thing is personalized, and the allegory proper should be something carefully stylized and deliberately sterilized of the full aspect of embodied life, so that the essential meaning or idea may come out with sufficient precision and force of clarity. Allegory is an intellectual form. One is not expected to believe in the personalization of the abstract quality. It is only an artistic device. So it's important to keep in mind that when Sri Aurobindo explains that Savitri means this, Satyavan means that, etc., that he doesn't mean that in the intellectual sense of an allegory, that these are abstractions that are being personified. A symbol expresses, on the contrary, not the play of abstract things or ideas put into imaged form, but a living truth or inward vision or experience of things, so inward, so subtle, so little belonging to the domain of intellectual abstraction and precision that it cannot be brought out except through symbolic images. In mystic poetry, the symbol ought to be as much as possible the natural body of the inner truth or vision, itself an intimate part of the experience. So Savitri is mystical poetry, and it involves this kind of symbolism, which Sri Aurobindo further distinguishes from conceptual symbols, which are more of the nature of allegories. Symbols may be of various kinds. There are those that are concealing images capable of intellectual interpretation, and there are those that have a more intimate life of their own and are not conceptual so much as occultly vital in their significance. There are still others that need a psychic or spiritual, or at least an inner and intuitive insight to identify oneself fully with their meaning. In a poem which uses conceptual symbols, the mind is more active, and the reader wants to know what it means to the mind. In the more deeply symbolist, still more in the mystic poem, the mind is submerged in the vividness of the reality, and any mental explanation falls far short of what is felt and lived in the deeper vital or psychic response. So all this has to be kept in mind when we look at what Sri Aurobindo says about Savitri as a symbol, that it's not a conceptual symbol, it's this deeper mystical kind of symbol. So we can't expect to entirely understand it with our minds. Nevertheless, we can certainly come closer to an understanding of what Savitri means. And for that purpose, it's necessary, first of all, to distinguish it from the well-known form in which the Savitri episode occurs in the Mahabharata. And specifically what Sri Aurobindo says about the Mahabharata in general, including its episodes. The Mahabharata especially is on a vast scale the epic of the soul and religious and ethical mind and social and political ideals and culture and life of India. The leading motive is the Indian idea of the Dharma. Here, the Vedic notion of the struggle between the Godheads of truth and light and unity and the powers of darkness and division and falsehood is brought out from the spiritual and religious and internal into the outer intellectual, ethical, and vital plane. So that makes a big difference between what is conveyed through a legend told in the Mahabharata and what Sri Aurobindo calls a symbolic myth of the Vedic cycle. The whole intention is quite different. Sri Aurobindo also mentioned specifically episodes such as Savitri. There is brought too into the frame of the narrative a very considerable element of other tales, legends, episodes, most of them of a significant character suitable to the method of itihasa. The ethical ideals of the race are expressed or are transmuted into the shape of tale and episode, as well as embodied in the figures of the story. So Savitri is one of these, and it conveys certain ethical ideals, and it does so in a very impressive way, which Sri Aurobindo had been struck by when he first began to read the Mahabharata in his early days after he came back to India and was living in Baroda. But it's a long way from that to Sri Aurobindo's conception of Savitri. Now, Sri Aurobindo does at times follow the Mahabharata very closely, particularly in narrative parts of the story, as in the canto where Narad reveals the fate of Satyavan, and Savitri replies. In the Mahabharata, the most relevant phrases are Sakrid ansho nipatiti, and then Sakrid vrito maya bharta nadvitiyam vrinomyaham. Sri Aurobindo practically translates the second line, once my heart chose and chooses not again. Once Sakrit vrito, once is chosen by me and not a second. So he's practically translated there a line from the Mahabharata, and the translation, he follows it even more closely after what follows. The word I have spoken can never be erased. It is written in the record book of God. Once the dice fall, Sakrid ansho nipatati, practically word for word, Sakrid once. Anshaha is the die, nipatati falls, thrown by the hand of fate in an eternal moment of the gods. So this is one among a number of places where Sri Aurobindo follows the Mahabharata fairly closely, and it shows that he was that he knew very well the form in which the legend occurs in the Mahabharata. But he gave it an entirely different turn because he saw in it, he believed that its origin was in a Vedic myth, a symbolic Vedic myth, and the difference therefore between the form in which it would have been told in the Veda, although it actually doesn't occur. There's no Vedic source for it. We have to reconstruct the Vedic myth on the basis of the story that we have in the Mahabharata. But the spirit of it would have been quite different. Rather than a tale of dharma, it would have had something to do with the Vedic Yoga, as in one way or another. The whole of the Rig Veda is a record of the great advance that Sri Aurobindo said had been made at this period in human history, and it was primarily an inner spiritual advance made by individuals. And So let's look now at how and why Sri Aurobindo chooses to find a symbolic myth in this rather than leaving it as a tale of dharma, as in the Mahabharata. And the first clue is in the names. The main names are highly Vedic, except for Narad, naturally. But he doesn't mention the role of Narad in his brief note on the symbolism, although Narad also does, as the personification, you might say, of Trikal Drishti, also has a kind of symbolic significance in Savitri, the power of prophecy, which interested Sri Aurobindo greatly. But Satya, the key words are Satya and Savitri, which we've seen already in discussing the Vedic Yoga, Satya being one of the three terms, Satyam, Mritam, Rahat, truth of being. And that's exactly what Sri Aurobindo says about Satyavan. Satyavan is the soul carrying the divine truth of being within itself. Satyavan, possessing the truth. So Savitri is the daughter of Savitri. It's a patronymic in which the vowels are lengthened, but the basic form of the name is that of the father, in this case, Surya Savitri, the daughter of the sun, the supramental deity. So she is the divine word, daughter of the sun, goddess of the supreme truth, because as we've already seen, Savitri represents the supramental truth. So these are highly Vedic names. We'll come back to what happens, what Savitri does in releasing Satyavan from the grip of death and ignorance. But with regard to the other main names, Ashwapati itself is a word that occurs in the Veda, though not as a name. Gopati is much more common, the lord of the cow, meaning the cow being the symbol of light and the horse being the symbol of energy. But Ashwapati's name is again highly Vedic, and Dumat Sena, Duman or Dumat, is a very common Vedic word. Dumat Sena, again, doesn't actually occur in the Veda, but it easily could have, because Sena is also a word that occurs in the Veda. So, Lord of the Shining Hosts. Ashwapati, Lord of the Horse, and Dumat Sena, Lord of the Shining Hosts. Both names formed using Vedic elements. Now, let's juxtapose what Sri Aurobindo says about Satyavan and Savitri with a sentence from the Life Divine. This is maybe a little complicated, but what I want to bring out is that, well, let me read first of all the sentence from the Life Divine. It is the pressure of the supramental and spiritual worlds which is preparing to develop here the manifest power of the Spirit, and by it open our being on the physical plane into the freedom and infinity of the superconscient divine. This is what I believe that the release of Satyavan from the grip of death symbolizes. The opening of the being on the physical plane into the freedom and infinity of the superconscient divine. That contact, that pressure, that would be precisely the contact and the pressure of Savitri, who represents the force from the supramental and spiritual worlds manifesting here. That contact, that pressure alone can liberate from the apparent inconscience, which was our starting point, the all-conscient Godhead concealed in us. So the grip of death and ignorance is the imprisonment in the apparent inconscience. And Satyavan, therefore, would correspond to the all-conscient Godhead concealed in us. In other words, the truth of being descended into the grip of death. So this, I think, if one contemplates these two passages side by side, one can easily see how Savitri symbolizes this central point in Sri Aurobindo's philosophy, that there is this possibility which has not even generally been acknowledged throughout much of the history of Indian spirituality after the Vedic times, when there was more and more pessimism about the possibility of the physical plane being redeemed, which is what the Satyavan's resurrection represents. Now, another aspect is the aspect of necessity, or ananki, a word that Sri Aurobindo uses in Savitri as well as in the Life Divine. The force that alters fate awakens in Savitri just before she actually, the moment when she conquers death at the end of Book 10. And I think that the action of Savitri corresponds to what Sri Aurobindo says only the supramental force can do in this passage. In the substance of the unconscious, there is a self-protective law of blind imperative necessity which limits the play of the possibilities that emerge from it or enter into it. This is what death with a capital D represents in Savitri, who appears as another major figure in the drama. Also in the Mahabharata, but in the Mahabharata it's Yama. Death in Savitri is not Yama. Death is Yama, the god of Dharma. And in fact, Yama is also called Dharma. In fact, death in Savitri represents the negation of the unconscious, this negation of all existence, consciousness, and bliss, which he calls the unconscious. And particularly this blind imperative necessity, the law of the unconscious. Only one of the main reasons that Sri Aurobindo kept ascending from plane to plane in his yoga through the various planes that he called higher mind, illumined mind, intuition, overmind, and finally supermind, is that at any plane short of the supermind, he found that it was impossible to overcome this difficulty of the unconscious. So I believe that this is also central to the symbolism of Savitri, and that the legend itself, as reinterpreted as a myth of the Vedic cycle, implies this symbolism. A supramental change of the whole substance of the being, and therefore necessarily of all its characters, powers, movements, takes place when the involved supermind in nature emerges to meet and join with the supramental light and power descending from supernature. Now, Sri Aurobindo has made it quite clear that Savitri is this light and power descending from supernature. And Satyavan, carrying the truth of being, but descended into the grip of death and ignorance, appears to be the counterpart of that, the involved supermind which emerges. So the meeting of Savitri and Satyavan is precisely what brings about this possibility of the supramental change. Now, as I said, there's nothing like the details of the legend of Savitri and Satyavan in the Veda, as the Rig Veda as it has come down to us, or any of the other Vedas. And yet the broad outlines of some of the Vedic myths do structurally, you might say, resemble the story of Satyavan and Savitri, in that there's something which is imprisoned in some kind of darkness, which is released through the instrumentality of something that comes from some higher plane, whether it's Indra in the most common version of the story, Satyam tad Indro Suryam viveda tamasi kshiyantam, to read just the words that I've highlighted. Indra found that truth. Satyam tat. Tat Satyam is that truth. which Sri Aurobindo often capitalizes when he quotes this verse. Both words, both that and truth, can be capitalized because this is precisely the involved inconscient. Satyam tad Indro Viveda found, even the sun dwelling in the darkness. Suryam tamasi kshiyantam. So in the Veda, in this legend of the Angiras rishis, who sometimes are referred to as the Navagwas and Dashagwas, in any case, following the cows, following the lead of Sarama, the intuition, they find the cave, which represents the inconscient, the subconscious and inconscient. And there, usually it's the cows that emerge, but sometimes it's the sun itself that comes forth in all its glory. And so they found that truth. And it's not just the sun that rises every morning or appears to rise from our earthly point of view, but the sun of truth, the sun which is the truth, Suryam, Satyam Tat Suryam, that truth, the sun dwelling in the darkness. So this is, I think, quite a close parallel if you go to the deep underlying meaning and leave aside some of the details of the actual legend. I think one can begin to see not only that the Vedic-looking names gave Sri Aurobindo a clue to the possibility that this was a Vedic myth reinterpreted in terms belonging to a later age, specifically the typal age, the age of Dharma. But in the Vedic age, it had a quite different significance, which seems to correspond quite well to the myths that have come down to us in the actual text of the Rig Veda. Now, generally speaking, the achievement of the ancestors, the ancestors of the rishis, the Purve Pitraha, the ancient fathers that they themselves refer to, was to find, I'll just read the highlighted words, they formed a path towards immortality. Earth stood wide for them, Prithvi Vitaste. The wording here is quite clear, Amrita Tvaya. There, the Veda is not using symbolism. Amrita means, Amrita Tva cannot mean anything in Sanskrit except immortality. That's exactly what it means. And here, for once, the Veda doesn't conceal its meaning in symbols. Prithvi represents the physical being and consciousness in Sri Aurobindo's interpretation. Prithvi Vitaste, V means wide. It opens out, or that is to say, the physical being breaks its limits, opens out to the light, and is upheld in its new wideness by the infinite consciousness. So this, in my interpretation of Sri Aurobindo's treatment of the legend of Savitri and Satyavan as a myth, is roughly what the myth stands for. This and it here occurs here by the agency not of Indra and Brihaspati and other masculine deities, but Aditi primarily. Aditi, the mother of the gods, with her sons. But after all, Aditi, although she is not mentioned very, very much, she's called Mata Aditi in the verse itself, Mother Aditi, with her sons. Here the gods are just the sons of Aditi, the Adityas. So ultimately, this is the central victory of the Vedic, not only of the rishis, but even their forerunners, what Sri Aurobindo calls the victory of the fathers. So this is the Vedic immortality. This immortality, so conceived as involving the physical being even, is what Sri Aurobindo found in the Veda, and that's what he didn't find so clearly expressed anywhere later in the Indian tradition, and that's an important reason, first of all, why he gave so much importance to the Veda, and second of all, why Savitri has such a close connection to the Veda. So putting this in even more general and abstract terms, Sri Aurobindo talks in The Life Divine about an upward tending force from below and an upward drawing and downward pressing force from above. That can be Aditi and the gods, the upward drawing and downward pressing force. You see both. Actually, in Savitri, you could say that the whole of the book one shows the action of this upward drawing force. Ashwapati ascends from plane to plane in the book of the Traveler of the Worlds, and Sri Aurobindo says, but still the invisible magnet drew his soul. So as he ascends from one plane to the next, there's still more beyond, and he continues his ascent because there's this constantly, this force which is constantly drawing him upward. Whereas in the second and third parts of the epic of Sri Aurobindo's Savitri, Savitri comes down and represents this pressure of that higher consciousness which Ashwapati has achieved. It's pressure on the material world in order to bring about a transformation that can only be achieved through the action of these two cooperating forces, both from above and below, the supermind descending from above and the involved supermind pressing upward from below, or tending upward. And the major Vedic deities, Agni and Indra, also are described by Sri Aurobindo in similar terms, that Agni represents force instinct with knowledge that sends its current upward, and Indra, light instinct with force which descends from heaven to earth. Indra brings all the other gods with him, the sons of Aditi. Agni is alone among the gods in representing this upward tending force from below, and Ashwapati represents something very similar in Savitri. The upward tending force from below is incarnated almost in Ashwapati. The Lord of the Horse, Sri Aurobindo doesn't actually use that expression in English, but he calls him the Lord of Life. At the end of Book 3, the Lord of Life resumed his mighty rounds in the scant field of the ambiguous globe, the Lord of Life being Ashwapati. The Lord of the Prana, the word Ashwa, usually signifying a horse, is used as a figure of the prana, the nervous energy, the vital breath. Its root is capable, among other senses, of the ideas of impulsion, force, possession, enjoyment, and we find all these meanings united in this figure of the steed of life to indicate the essential tendencies of the pranic energy. But Ashwapati is also called by a specific Vedic epithet which is constantly applied to Agni. This now was witnessed in that son of force. In him that high transition laid its base. This is near the beginning of the canto that I read some passages from, the first canto of the Yoga of the King. And for lack of time, maybe I won't read the whole Sanskrit verse, but in the second half of the first line you have Sahasa Suno, O son of force, literally, of Suno, Sunaha Sahas, Suno rather, Suno Sahasaha. Sunu is son, Sahas is force, son of force. And this is constantly applied to Agni, as in this verse, O fire, O son of force. And later in the verse you also have the words Ashwa and Duman in the second line, born by the horses of power. Those are the Ashwa, Ashwar, Vahamano, Ashwar, and then luminous, Duman, as I said, is a very common Vedic word. So again, we see here in this Vedic verse close affinities with Savitri, both in the terms that are used in relation to the characters of Savitri and the specific quoting of the phrase Sahasasuno, or another equivalent phrase, Urjo Napat, and Sri Aurobindo also has the variant in Savitri, O son of strength, who climbs creation's peaks. So Ashwapati seems to fit quite well with the role of Agni in the Veda. So now we'll go on to a somewhat different topic. We've been talking now about the symbolism of Savitri as a whole, the symbolism of the characters themselves and the main events. And now we're going to talk about symbols and allusions which are incorporated in passages in Savitri, sometimes just in passing. Pursuing all knowledge like a questing hound, for example, was a good example. The questing hound is an unmistakable allusion to the hound of heaven, Sarama. But that's just a specific line, and in many cases, some of the other lines that we saw already that are definitely Vedic allusions. These occur in specific passages, but sometimes they also represent very central aspects of what Savitri is all about, and so these are also highly significant. The reason I've said allusions is there are some references to the Veda which don't involve symbolism at all, because the Veda doesn't always express itself symbolically, especially in some of the later hymns. For example, the hymn of creation in the 10th mandala, where Sri Aurobindo alludes to the inconscient ocean. Apraketam salilam, for example, is a phrase that occurs in the hymn of creation. That is a symbol, but when he says the original desire born in the void peered out, that seems to be an allusion to the line that refers to the kama as being the first thing that emerged from this inconscient ocean, desire. There the Veda uses the word kama, which means desire, and it's not expressed in symbolic terms. So there's a definite allusion to the Veda, and there are some others like that, not necessarily symbolic. But the main thing is, because the Vedic, the whole system of the Veda was expressed in terms of a system of symbols, therefore it's necessary to understand its symbolism. And Sri Aurobindo, in writing Savitri, was writing mystic poetry, which also involves a lot of symbolism, and sometimes it was specifically Vedic symbolism. So it's useful to refer to a letter that Sri Aurobindo once wrote on different kinds of symbols. And he said, "A symbol, as I understand it, is the form on one plane that represents a truth of another. For instance, a flag is the symbol of a nation. But generally, all forms are symbols. This body of ours is a symbol of our real being, and everything is a symbol of some higher reality." This is corresponds to what he was saying about in symbolic poetry, everything being a matter of realities, experiential realities. Even the symbol itself is something which is experienced and not an abstraction. But still, he distinguishes different types of symbols, and this is a very useful distinction. There are, however, different kinds of symbols. Conventional symbols, such as the Vedic rishis, formed with objects taken from their surroundings. The cow stood for light because the same word go meant both ray and cow, and because the cow was their most precious possession, which maintained their life and was constantly in danger of being robbed and concealed. Sri Aurobindo devotes several chapters of The Secret of the Veda to explaining and supporting his interpretation of the Vedic cow. But it is a fact that sometimes the word go cannot be understood to mean anything but a ray of light. And besides, there are other words for a cow, such as usra, which definitely mean a ray of light, and even etymologically express quite clearly the idea of light or radiance. So But what's a little surprising is that even in Savitri, Sri Aurobindo incorporates this symbol, and he could do it partly because, as he says, once created, such a symbol becomes alive. The rishis vitalized it, and it became a part of their realization. It appeared in their visions as an image of spiritual light. And he seems to suggest that this symbol was so vitalized by the rishis that the symbol of the cow of light is still a living symbol today, which he could use in Savitri, not only in the line that we've already read about the rescue of the lost herds of the sun, but in a couple of other contexts. Thus streamed down from the realm of early light, ethereal thinkings into matter's world. Its gold-horned herds trooped into earth's cave heart. So here he makes, in the last line, a very beautiful use of this image of the herds. Part of the reason it works is that he uses the word herds rather than cows. If he talked about gold-horned cows trooping into earth's cave heart, it would have fallen flat. But herds implying a multitude and being applicable to different things is not, even gold-horned, the horns definitely suggest the image of a cow, but somehow it's done in a manner that works even in English poetry, which doesn't have at all this tradition of the association of cows with light. And also in this other passage, in the dream twilight of the ideal, and half-heard lowings drew the listening ear as if the sun god's brilliant kine were there. It also works in English poetry partly because you have in the Western tradition itself the Homeric poems in which the kine of Helios, the cows of the sun god, Helios being the Greek counterpart of Surya, they're there in the Odyssey. And so the herds of the sun also, the kine of Helios, normally you would use a sort of archaic word to refer to them, to not insist too much on the physical image of a cow. But in a mythological context like that, it works. So Sri Aurobindo has been able to use even this conventional symbol. For the most part, however, the Vedic symbols were not conventional in that way. They were quite natural symbols, and are symbols that a poet today might want to use. What we might call life symbols, or even in prose one uses these symbols to make an idea more vivid. What we might call life symbols, such as are not artificially chosen or mentally interpreted in a conscious, deliberate way, but derived naturally from our day-to-day life and grow out of the surroundings which condition our normal path of living. So he gives examples of these life symbols. To the ancients, the mountain was a symbol of the path of yoga, level above level, peak upon peak. Of course, that would be true even when mountains existed long before human beings evolved. But the symbolism of the mountain in the Veda relates to climbing the mountain and climbing from level to level, from peak to peak. And therefore, Sri Aurobindo refers to it as a life symbol in that the way that it's used in the Veda as a symbol of the path of yoga has to do with our relation to mountains when we climb them. That it's usually not easy to climb a mountain. It's an action which involves special effort, and the point that we reach is different from the point that we started at in a significant way. So it's a perfect symbol for the path of yoga, this ascending journey. A journey involving the crossing of rivers, there it's not an ascent, but just a journey. But again, involving obstacles and the facing of lurking enemies, both animal and human, conveyed a similar idea. Animal enemies, for example, the red wolf who waits by the fordless stream is there in Savitri. But more generally, the journey is one of the main symbols in the Veda and is also an important symbol of Savitri because traveling means journeying, and the longest book of Savitri is the book of the Traveler of the Worlds. That's also an ascent, but you can see that this is a very central aspect of Savitri as the journey or the ascent or the climb as an image for the path of yoga. Now, here I'm quoting from The Secret of the Veda, where Sri Aurobindo says, all the principal features of that outward life which they, the rishis, saw around them, the mystic poets took and turned into significant images of their inner life. In other words, they made great use of these life symbols. The life of man is represented as a sacrifice to the gods, a journey sometimes figured as a crossing of dangerous waters, sometimes as an ascent from level to level of the hill of being, and thirdly, as a battle against hostile nations. So there are 3 or 4 symbols mentioned there, depending on whether you distinguish the ascent from the journey. But the sacrifice to the gods sounds more like a conventional symbol. But it was so living to the rishis that they treated it in the same way together with the others, these other life symbols. It was such a constant part of their life that it became, for practical purposes, a life symbol which is often combined even in the same word when sacrifice is referred to not as yajna but as adhura, from a root which means the path, adhva. And so the sacrifice itself is a journey. And Sri Aurobindo says that in his writings on the Veda. First of all, the sacrifice is the giving by man of what he possesses in his being to the higher or divine nature, and its fruit is the farther enrichment of his manhood by the lavish bounty of the gods. So that's the meaning of the sacrifice. But the wealth thus gained constitutes a state of spiritual riches, prosperity, felicity, which is itself a power for the journey and a force of battle. So the sacrifice itself is inseparable from the other images of the journey and the battle. For the sacrifice is a journey, a progression. The sacrifice itself travels led by Agni up the divine path to the gods, and is also a battle, for it is opposed by the Panis, Vritras, and other powers of evil and falsehood. Now, in Savitri also, you have these 3 images which the Veda is constantly combining, of the sacrifice, the journey, and the battle. You have them combined in the same passage, or 1 or 2 of them combined in other passages, but in one place all 3 of them come together. On the altar, throwing thy thoughts, thy heart, thy works. So here you have the sacrifice. Thy fate is a long sacrifice to the gods, till they have opened to thee thy secret self, and made thee one with the indwelling God. O soul, it continues, O soul, intruder in nature's ignorance, armed traveler to the unseen supernal heights, thy spirit's fate is a battle and ceaseless march against invisible opponent powers, a passage from matter into timeless self. So Sri Aurobindo goes directly from the image of our fate as a sacrifice to its being a journey and a battle in exactly the same way that the Veda very often does. Then we have this line at the beginning of the 4th canto of Savitri, on a height he stood that looked towards greater heights. This is a clear Vedic allusion. Sri Aurobindo very often quoted this line, Yat sano sanumaruhad bhurya spashtakartuam, as one ascends from peak to peak, there is made clear the much that has still to be done. And it's clearly the same image of a height looking towards greater heights, which are still to be ascended. And this translation that I've quoted here, Sri Aurobindo quotes it several times in slightly different translations, but this is at the end of the human cycle. As I said, the human cycle not only begins with the Veda, the symbolic age, but it ends with the Veda when it anticipates the possibility of a spiritual age. Sri Aurobindo draws on the Veda for images of what that future realization might look like, because Sri Aurobindo was so fascinated by the Veda because he found something in it which he needed in his preoccupation with a future realization. There's a place in his diary where he comments on the fact that his individual mind, although it was focused on the present and the future, and he had always been relatively uninterested in the past, that it went back readily to a far past in which the future was prefigured. So this, when Sri Aurobindo writes about the Veda, when he spends so much time doing Vedic scholarship and incorporates so many references to the Veda in the life divine, the human cycle, and then especially in Savitri, it's because he found that the process of spiritual ascent, which is represented particularly by this line, and which one sees throughout Savitri, particularly the whole of the first book, as I mentioned, is about this ascent from height to greater height. So this is what Sri Aurobindo found in the Veda, and in this case, although you have a single line which you could say is an allusion to a similar line in the Veda, it's almost a paraphrase. It's not just a line that occurs in passing. It's a line that sets the tone for everything that follows, because Ashwapati has already, in the third canto, the Yoga of the Soul's release, he's already achieved enough. He's already a yogi. He could have stopped there. Most yogis would have. Sri Aurobindo continues. He continued and always looked towards greater heights, as Ashwapati does here, and as the Vedic rishis did. There was always much that has still to be done. The journey was never over. The ascent never reached its culmination. This ascent to the first spiritual levels, and this is what Sri Aurobindo writes in the human cycle with reference to this line. This ascent to the first spiritual levels would not be the end of the divine march, a culmination that left nothing more to be achieved on earth. For there would be still yet higher levels within the supramental realm, as the old Vedic poets knew when they spoke of the spiritual life as a constant ascent. I think in this passage, Sri Aurobindo is using the word supramental, not in the technical sense that he adopted later, where he distinguishes supermind from overmind. I think this would, at the time when he wrote this in around 1918, he was using the word supramental to refer to the higher planes of consciousness, which are the subject of much of the Rig Veda. Whereas the Veda itself only glimpses the supermind. It has the principle of the supermind, as Sri Aurobindo said. Sri Aurobindo found it in the Veda, but not sufficiently developed for his purpose. Nevertheless, it gave him the clue. And elsewhere also, this is, I think, in the Life Divine, Sri Aurobindo talks about the much that has still to be done. There is a will in nature to effectuate a true manifestation of the embodied life of the Spirit, to complete what she has begun by a passage from the ignorance to the knowledge, to throw off her mask, and to reveal herself as the luminous consciousness force carrying in her the eternal existence and its universal delight of being. You see, whenever Sri Aurobindo refers to this phrase, it's always when he's talking about something very central to his whole philosophy, his yoga, his whole worldview, his interpretation of history, everything. There is always much that has still to be done. It then becomes obvious that there is something not yet accomplished. There becomes clear to view the much that has still to be done. Bhuri aspashta kartuam. The much becomes clear that has to be done. Kartuam is the Vedic form of kartavyam in classical Sanskrit. So we'll just take a brief look at natural symbols, which is the name I've given. Sri Aurobindo doesn't exactly coin a phrase for this. Symbols that have an inherent appositeness and power of their own. And he gives, again, two examples. Akasha, or etheric space, is a symbol of the infinite, all-pervading, eternal Brahman. In any nationality, it would convey the same meaning. That doesn't mean, of course, that every nationality would develop this symbol in the way that was done in the age of the Upanishads, where perhaps this experience of the infinite, all-pervading, eternal Brahman is even more prominent than in the Veda. Nevertheless, the symbolism is inherent in the nature of things. In a sense, when the material world originated, this infinite etheric space came into being as a kind of translation into material terms of this supernal reality of the infinite Brahman. And likewise with the sun. Also, the sun stands universally for the supramental light, the divine gnosis, even though, of course, not every culture has a clear idea of what this supramental light might be. But in any case, to take the first of those images, the etheric space, it's represented in the Veda mainly by the figure of Varuna. The divine is existence, all-embracing, infinite, and pure. Varuna brings to us the infinite oceanic space of the divine soul and its ethereal elemental purity. So this is the divine as existence, the Sat aspect of Satchidananda, and that's what is symbolized by this image of the ether. And you have that in Savitri in places, for example, in the wide, signless ether of the self, in the unchanging silence, white and nude, aloof, resplendent, like gold dazzling suns, veiled by the ray no mortal eye can bear. The spirits, bare and absolute potencies, burn in the solitude of the thoughts of God. There's a similar passage later on in Book 3, an eye has opened upon timelessness. Infinity takes back the forms it gave, and through God's darkness or his naked light, his million rays return into the sun. But here the striking image which relates this to the Veda is these million rays returning into the sun. Because of course rays ordinarily emanate from the sun but don't return into it in physical terms. And so Sri Aurobindo is inverting the process of nature in a way that one, I think, was suggested by this verse in the Veda, which he often referred to, where the 10 hundreds of the sun's rays came together. Ritena ritam apihitam dhruvam bam suryasya yatra vimunchanti ashwan dashashata sahatas tustadeka tadekam. Sorry, there's no swara hidden there. Devanam shreshtham vapusham apashyam. So tadekam, that's that one, the same that as in satyam, that truth also, which we had applied to the sun. And here you have the sun as Surya. Suryasya yatra vimunchanti ashwan. There is a permanent dhruvam, a truth hidden by a truth. This is the word rita, not satya. which Sri Aurobindo sometimes translates right, when both words have to be distinguished, satyam and ritam. A truth hidden by a truth, where the sun unyokes his horses. The 10 hundreds of his rays came together, that one. I saw the most glorious of the forms of the gods. So this is the 10, of course here it's only 1,000, actually 1000, whereas in Savitri refers to the million rays. But very large numbers in poetry have pretty much the same effect. And this is also related to another line, another verse, Vedic verse about Surya, which is again of interest because it distinguishes between a higher light and a highest light. We saw earlier an occurrence of a supreme light, the highest light, and that's a phrase that Sri Aurobindo uses fairly often, a supreme, supernal, or highest light. That is Uttamam Jyotihi, and it occurs here, Udvayam Tamasaspari, beholding, that's beyond this darkness. Jyotish Pashyanta Uttaram, beholding a higher light beyond this darkness. We have followed it and reached Aganma, Devam Devatra Suryam, Aganma Jyotirut Uttamam. So we've reached the highest light of all, Surya, divine in the divine being, Devam Devatra Suryam, Aganma, we have gone to, we have reached, Jyotihi Uttamam, the highest light. So there's a difference between a higher light and a highest light. Again, this doesn't make very much sense in physical terms. Of course, the sun goes up, and then it comes down and down, and that marks the different times of day. But in our ordinary lives, the sun reaching the high point doesn't have any profound significance, except that if you're in a hot climate, it becomes unbearably hot at that time. But higher light and highest light are phrases that only really makes much sense if they're understood in some kind of symbolic context. And that's what you have in Savitri. Sri Aurobindo explains what the higher and the highest, as well as in the Veda. Sri Aurobindo explains in the Vedic context what they mean. This is the first aspect of Surya, that he is the supreme light of the truth attained by the human being after his liberation from the ignorance. The higher light of Surya is that by which vision rises on our darkness and moves towards the superconscient. The highest, that other greater truth vision, which having attained, moves in the farthest supreme world of the infinite. So that would be what Sri Aurobindo calls the supermind. But there's not only one higher light, there's higher and higher, there are higher and higher planes of light, of luminosity, which Sri Aurobindo describes in many of his writings in the Life Divine, in this, the synthesis of yoga, and in his letters. In Savitri, it's the last 5 cantos of Book 2, which are devoted especially to the ascent from the higher mind, which he there calls the greater mind, to the illumined mind, the heavens of the ideal, intuition. Overmind is the kingdoms of the greater knowledge. And then finally in Book 3, there's the vision of the supramental creation. But here, at the beginning of those series of cantos, you have a gold supernal sun. This would be this highest light, the highest form of the sun. A gold supernal sun of timeless truth poured down the mystery of the eternal ray through a silence quivering with the word of light on an endless ocean of discovery. Far off, he saw the joining hemispheres. On meditation's mounting edge of trance, great stairs of thought climbed up to unborn heights, where time's last ridges touch eternity's skies, and nature speaks to the spirit's absolute. So here, Ashwapati's whole ascent through these higher planes of the consciousness beyond mind, these great stairs of thought, are referred to. And if we go back to this gold supernal sun of timeless truth, that's the source of the light on all these lower planes. The gold supernal sun would be finally the supermind, whereas the joining hemispheres would be where the overmind joins the supermind. And so this is what is the way in which this image of the Sun of Truth and higher light is introduced in Savitri. And Sri Aurobindo says about these different planes, if we accept the Vedic image of the Sun of Truth, we may compare the action of the higher mind to a composed and steady sunshine, the energy of the illumined mind beyond it to an outpouring of massive lightnings of flaming sun stuff. So the source of the light is the supermind. It's the same light, but you have a higher light and a still higher light. First of all, a higher light than our ordinary intellect, and then you have higher and higher planes. Still beyond, you have the intuition, and at the source of that, you have the cosmic mind, an overmind that covers, as with the wide wings of some creative oversoul, this whole lower hemisphere of the knowledge ignorance. So these are the joining hemispheres where overmind links with the greater truth consciousness, while at the same time with its brilliant golden lid, it veils the face of the greater truth from our sight. The golden lid, of course, is the Hiranmaya Patra of the Isha Upanishad, but that verse near the end of the Isha Upanishad is a paraphrase of the verse that I quoted from the Veda about the truth hidden by a truth. When the Isha Upanishad says that the face of the sun is hidden by a golden lid, the face of the truth, Hiranmayena Patrena Satyasyapi Hitam Mukham, the face of the truth is hidden by a golden lid. It's this image of the sun as the supramental truth hidden by the lid of the overmind. And Sri Aurobindo, in fact, quotes that verse about the truth hidden by a truth at the beginning of the last chapter of Book 1 of the Life Divine, where he explains the difference between supermind and overmind. And the joining hemispheres at the end of Book 2, Ashwapati arrives at the overmind. He scanned the secrets of the overmind. He bore the rapture of the oversoul. A borderer of the empire of the sun, attuned to the supernal harmonies, he linked creation to the eternal spheres. Here, the empire of the sun is clearly the supermind, and the overmind is that which is on the borders of that empire. And then our greater self of knowledge waits for us, a supreme light. That's the Uttamam Jyotihi, the highest light, in the truth-conscious Ritachit Vas. I already quoted that line. It sees from summits beyond thinking mind. It moves in a splendid air, transcending life. It shall descend and make earth's life divine. So this gives some idea of how Sri Aurobindo uses this symbol of the sun in Savitri. There are other symbols that we won't have time for today. For example, the symbol of the ocean. We've had brief glimpses of that symbol. The ocean is an important, oceans and rivers. There's a whole chapter in The Secret of the Veda on the oceans and rivers, what they symbolize. You have oceans and rivers, rivers poured down a bliss and luminous force, for example, in the canto about Ashwapati's yoga, and oceans of being met his voyaging soul in the same canto. So rivers and oceans are Vedic symbols which occur very frequently. There are other symbols that could have been shown. For example, we haven't even looked at the symbol of Agni itself in Savitri, which occurs in a few places, particularly referring to the immortal, when the fire the inner fire is described as immortal in our mortal poverty. The immortal in mortals is a regular phrase which is used in the Veda to describe Agni. So there are many things like that, but I think we'll have to stop here. Now, I was going to end with a section on the power of the word, which links this talk to the one that I'm going to give on Monday about Savitri as mantra. But because the power of the word has to do with the mantra, one of the things that connects Savitri with the Veda is that the idea Sri Aurobindo had of writing mantric poetry in English, as he did in Savitri. It's the Vedic concept of the mantra, which he's extending there to apply to not only to Sanskrit, ancient Sanskrit poetry, but to all poetry that reaches a certain height. And so I can use that to introduce that talk. And so I think I'll stop here.